Everyone deserves a second chance, even kings who have fallen from grace. Love has a way of finding us in the darkest places, when we least expect it and need it most. Deep beneath a crumbling castle, they keep Alpha King Thorne in chains. He was once the most feared ruler in the realm, but betrayal brought him low. The guards whisper that he's gone mad with rage, that any Omega who comes too close meets death. When 34-year-old Mira is sent to bring him meals, she expects a monster. She finds a broken man who remembers his humanity. Their bond grows, slowly, built on quiet moments and shared understanding. But Mira carries secrets about the rebellion that destroyed his kingdom and her own hidden bloodline. What happens when the kingdom's most dangerous prisoner discovers that his quiet caretaker holds the key to everything he's lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Raven's Hollow Castle like a shroud, wrapping its crumbling towers in grey despair. Once, these walls had gleamed white as fresh snow, their banners snapping proudly in mountain winds. Now they stood scarred and weathered, testament to a kingdom that had lost its way. Moss grew thick between ancient stones, and ivy crawled up walls that had witnessed centuries of triumph and tragedy. Mira pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she hurried across the courtyard, her worn leather boots splashing through puddles that reflected the overcast sky. At 34, she had learned to make herself invisible, a skill that had kept her alive these past 5 years. Her dark hair was always pinned back in a simple bun, her clothes practical and unremarkable. To anyone watching, she was just another kitchen servant going about her duties. But beneath the surface, Mira carried secrets that would shake the very foundations of the current regime. The small silver pendant hidden beneath her rough-spun tunic had belonged to her grandmother, its intricate engravings worn smooth by generations of healers who had served the crown. Few knew that the herbs she ground for the castle's meals were chosen for more than flavor. They carried the old knowledge, the healing wisdom that had once made her family trusted advisors to kings. "Mira!" The voice of Ilara, the head cook, cut through the morning air. "Where have you been, girl? The bread won't knead itself, and we've got Lord Brennan's feast to prepare." Ilara was a woman of substance in every sense, broad-shouldered from years of lifting heavy pots, with greying hair that she kept covered beneath a white cap. She had run the castle kitchens for over 2 decades, serving under 3 different regimes with the practical wisdom of someone who understood that people needed to eat, regardless of who wore the crown. "Forgive me," Mira said, quickening her pace. "I stopped by the herb garden. The thyme wasn't drying properly." "Always fussing with those plants of yours," Ilara muttered, but her tone held affection. In the 5 years since Mira had arrived seeking work, the older woman had become something like a mother to her. "Well, get yourself inside. We've a busy day ahead." The kitchen was already alive with activity. Scullery maids scrubbed pots, their hands red from hot water and harsh soap. Young boys turned spits over the great hearth, their faces flushed from the heat. The air was thick with the scent of baking bread and roasting meat, mixed with the ever-present smell of wood smoke that seemed to permeate every stone in the castle. Mira had found sanctuary here among the chaos. In the kitchens, she was valued for her skills with herbs and her gentle way with the other servants. No one questioned her past or wondered why a woman of her obvious education, she could read and write, skills rare among the servant class, had come seeking such humble work. The truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. Mira's family had once been among the most trusted advisors to the crown, their knowledge of healing arts making them invaluable during times of war and peace alike. But 5 years ago, when the rebellion came, they had been branded traitors and hunted down like animals. She was the last of her line, carrying knowledge that could heal or harm, depending on whose hands wielded it. "Mira," Ilara called out, her voice taking on a serious tone. "I need to speak with you." They moved away from the bustle of the kitchen, into a small alcove where barrels of flour and sacks of grain were stored. The sounds of preparation faded to a distant murmur. "You know I've always looked after my girls," Ilara began, her weathered hands twisting in her apron. "But sometimes duties come down from above that I can't shield you from." A chill ran down Mira's spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "What kind of duties?" "Guard Captain Marcus came to see me this morning. There's a task needs doing, and he specifically requested one of my most trusted servants." Ilara's eyes were kind, but worried. "It's about the prisoner in the lower dungeons." Mira's blood ran cold. Everyone in the castle knew about the prisoner, though few spoke of him openly. Alpha King Thorne, the last of the old rulers, had been held in the deepest cells for 5 years now. The stories about him varied depending on who was telling them, but all agreed on one thing: he was dangerous beyond measure. "They say he's killed 3 servants already," whispered young Benna, a scullery maid who had crept close enough to overhear. Her eyes were wide with fear and fascination. "Tore them apart with his bare hands, he did. Mad as a rabid wolf." "That's enough," Ilara said sharply. "We don't deal in gossip here." But Mira had heard the stories. The guards spoke in hushed tones about the fallen king's rage, how he would lunge at anyone who came too close, snarling like the beast they claimed he'd become. They said his eyes glowed in the darkness, that he spoke to shadows, that the very air around his cell crackled with malevolent energy. "What does the captain want me to do?" Mira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Feed him," Ilara said simply, "twice daily, at dawn and dusk. The guards will escort you down and back, but you'll be the one to slide the tray through the slot in his cell door." "Why me?" The question came out smaller than Mira intended. Ilara's expression softened. "Because you're steady, child. You don't spook easily, and you follow orders without question. Marcus needs someone reliable for this duty." What Ilara didn't say, what she perhaps didn't even know, was that Guard Captain Marcus had other reasons for choosing Mira. She had noticed his attention over the past months, the way his eyes lingered on her when she passed through the corridors. Marcus was a man who collected information the way others collected coins, and he had a particular interest in anyone who might have connections to the old regime. "When do I start?" Mira asked. "Today, this afternoon for the evening meal." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt anything but routine. Mira ground spices with unusual care, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had spent 5 years avoiding attention, building a life of quiet anonymity. Now she was being thrust into proximity with the most dangerous man in the kingdom. As she worked, fragments of memories surfaced, stories her grandmother had told her about the old days, when the kingdom had been united under wise and just rulers. Before the rebellion, before the current lords had seized power with promises of a better future that had never materialized. Her grandmother had spoken of Alpha King Thorne with a mixture of respect and sadness, calling him a man who had tried to bridge the old ways with the new, only to be brought down by those who saw change as weakness. The afternoon meal preparation began, and Mira found herself assigned to prepare a simple tray: bread, cheese, a portion of the stew that bubbled constantly in the great pot by the fire. Nothing fancy, nothing that could be used as a weapon. The guards had specific instructions about what the prisoner could and could not receive. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Guard Captain Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was a man of average height but commanding presence, his dark hair streaked with grey at the temples, his uniform immaculate despite the castle's general air of decay. His eyes, sharp and calculating, found Mira immediately. "You're ready?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Mira nodded, lifting the wooden tray she had prepared. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "Good! Follow me and listen carefully to what I tell you." They left the warmth and noise of the kitchen behind. Marcus leading her through corridors that grew progressively colder and darker. Oil lamps flickered in iron brackets, casting dancing shadows on stone walls that seemed to press closer with each step they took downward. "The prisoner is dangerous," Marcus said as they walked, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. "He's an alpha in his prime, despite his imprisonment, and his kind are not known for their control. You will approach his cell, slide the tray through the slot, and step back immediately. You will not speak to him. You will not look directly at him, and you will not respond to anything he might say to you. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." The previous servants who attempted this duty, they made the mistake of thinking they could show compassion to a creature that no longer understands the concept. They paid for that mistake with their lives. They descended a final flight of stone steps, the air growing thick and oppressive. The smell here was different, not just the mustiness of disuse, but something else, something wild and untamed that made the primitive part of Mira's mind whisper. Warnings. The dungeon corridor stretched ahead of them, lined with empty cells that had once held common criminals. But at the very end, behind a door reinforced with iron bars and blessed with protective symbols, lay their destination. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their faces grim with the knowledge of what lay beyond. They straightened at Marcus's approach, nodding their acknowledgement of his authority. "Open it," Marcus commanded. The heavy door swung open with a groan of protesting hinges, revealing a stone corridor that led to a final cell. The darkness seemed absolute, broken only by a single torch that flickered weakly in a bracket several feet away from the bars. And there, in that pool of uncertain light, Mira caught her first glimpse of the man who had once ruled a kingdom. Alpha King Thorne sat with his back against the far wall of his cell, heavy iron shackles binding his wrists and ankles. The chains that held him were no ordinary metal. They gleamed with the faint luminescence of enchanted iron, designed to suppress the supernatural strength and abilities that made Alphas so formidable. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, unkempt but not entirely wild. His clothing, though worn and stained, had once been of fine quality, but it was his eyes that caught Mira's attention and held it despite Marcus's warnings. They were not the eyes of a madman or a beast. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, but who still retained the spark of intelligence and humanity that no amount of suffering could extinguish. For just a moment, their gazes met across the space between them. And in that moment, Mira saw not a monster to be feared, but a soul as lost and lonely as her own. The carved wooden bowl trembled slightly in Mira's hands as she approached the cell door. It was a simple vessel, worn smooth by countless meals, served and cleaned, but now it seemed to carry the weight of her entire world. The bread she had carefully arranged beside the small portion of stew suddenly felt like an offering to something far more significant than mere hunger. "Remember what I told you," Marcus whispered behind her, his voice barely audible but sharp with warning. Quick and quiet. The iron slot in the cell door was just wide enough for the tray, positioned at waist height to allow food to be passed through without requiring the guards to unlock the heavy barrier. As Mira knelt to slide the bowl through the opening, she was acutely aware of the figure watching her from the shadows beyond. Alpha King Thorne remained motionless against the far wall, but she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. The stories had painted him as a wild creature, feral and unpredictable, but the man she glimpsed in the flickering torchlight seemed almost unnaturally still. There was a quality of restraint about him that spoke of tremendous self-control rather than the mindless rage the guards whispered about. The bowl scraped softly against stone as she pushed it through the slot. For a moment, nothing happened. The cell remained silent, except for the distant drip of water somewhere in the dungeon's depths, and the barely perceptible sound of Marcus shifting his weight behind her. Then Thorne moved. It was not the sudden, violent motion she had been prepared for. Instead, he rose from his position with a fluid grace that the heavy chains could not fully suppress. Even bound and imprisoned, there was something undeniably regal about the way he carried himself. The shackles clinked softly as he approached. The door, each step measured and deliberate. "Thank you." The words were spoken quietly, with a voice that held the roughness of disuse, but none of the madness the stories suggested. Mira found herself frozen in place, caught between Marcus's strict instructions and the unexpected courtesy of the man before her. She should have stepped back immediately. She should have avoided meeting his gaze. Instead, she found herself looking up at him through the bars, and for the second time that evening their eyes met. Up close, she could see the details that distance and shadows had hidden. Thorne's face bore the lines of someone who had carried great responsibility, but there was no cruelty in his features. His eyes, a deep brown that reminded her of rich earth after rain, held intelligence, and a weariness that spoke of burdens carried long past their breaking point. "You're new to this duty," he observed, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the stone corridor. Mira felt Marcus's hand close on her shoulder, a warning grip that pulled her back from whatever spell had held her in place. But even as she stepped away from the cell door, she could not shake the feeling that everything she had been told about this man was, if not entirely false, then certainly incomplete. "I told you not to speak to him," Marcus hissed in her ear as they made their way back through the dungeon corridors. His anger was palpable, but beneath it she sensed something else. Fear, perhaps, or frustration that his careful instructions had been ignored. He was polite, Mira said, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded naive even to her own ears. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression harsh in the lamplight. "Polite? That creature has killed 3 people with his bare hands. Politeness is just another weapon in his arsenal, one designed to lower your guard until he can strike." They climbed the stone steps in tense silence, leaving the oppressive atmosphere of the dungeons behind. But even as they emerged into the relatively warm and well-lit corridors of the castle's main levels, Mira could not shake the image of those intelligent brown eyes, watching her with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. The evening passed in a blur of kitchen duties and routine tasks, but Mira's mind kept returning to those few moments in the dungeon. She found herself questioning everything she had been told about the imprisoned king. If he was truly the monster the stories portrayed, why had he thanked her so courteously? Why had his eyes held such profound sadness rather than the burning rage everyone spoke of? That night, lying on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Mira stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what she had witnessed with what she had been told. The other servants' whispered stories of violence and madness seemed suddenly hollow, like tales told to frighten children rather than accurate accounts of observed behavior. She thought of her grandmother's stories about the old days when the kingdom had been prosperous and united. Her grandmother had never spoken ill of the former royal family, had in fact seemed to hold them in considerable respect. But those had been the reminiscences of an old woman, and Mira had assumed they were colored by nostalgia and the passage of time. Now she wondered if perhaps her grandmother's memories had been more accurate than anyone wanted to admit. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with autumn mist clinging to the castle walls like gossamer. Mira went about her usual duties with mechanical precision, but part of her attention was already focused on the evening meal and her return to the dungeons. She told herself it was merely curiosity, a natural human desire to understand what she had witnessed. But beneath that rationalization lay something deeper, a recognition that had passed between her and the man in the cell, a sense of shared understanding that defied explanation. Ilara noticed her distraction. "You seem troubled, child. Was your first visit to the prisoner so difficult?" "It was different than I expected," Mira admitted carefully. The older woman's expression grew concerned. "Different how?" Before Mira could answer, Guard Captain Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere, conversations dying away as the servants focused on their work with renewed intensity. "How did our new volunteer perform yesterday evening?" Marcus asked Ilara, but his eyes were fixed on Mira. "She completed her duties without incident, Captain," Ilara replied neutrally. "Good, she'll continue with the assignment." Marcus moved closer to Mira, lowering his voice. "I trust you've given thought to what I told you yesterday about the importance of maintaining proper protocol." "Yes, sir," Mira said, meeting his gaze steadily. Something in her tone seemed to satisfy him because he nodded and stepped back. "Excellent. The evening meal will be ready at the usual time?" "Of course." "Captain." When Marcus had gone, Ilara moved closer to Mira, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Be careful, child. There are currents in this castle deeper and more dangerous than you know. The captain is not a man to cross, and the prisoner, well, he's been the subject of much speculation over the years." "What kind of speculation?" Ilara glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. "There are those who question the official story of his downfall, who wonder if perhaps the rebellion was not quite the noble cause it was painted to be." Her eyes grew distant. "I've served in this castle for 20 years, child. I remember what life was like under the old regime. There was prosperity then, and justice. People felt safe in their homes and their beds. And now? Now we serve lords who rule through fear and taxation, who care more for their own comfort than the welfare of their people." Ilara's expression grew troubled. "But such thoughts are dangerous to voice aloud. Remember that, Mira. In this castle, walls have ears, and even trusted servants can disappear if they speak the wrong words to the wrong people." The warning hung heavy between them as they returned to their work. But Mira found that rather than deterring her curiosity about the imprisoned king, Ilara's words had only intensified it. If there were questions about the official story, if there were doubts about the nobility of those who had taken power, then perhaps her instinct about Thorne's character had been correct. That evening, as she prepared the simple meal that would take her back to the dungeons, Mira made a decision that would change the course of her carefully constructed life. She would return to the cell, and this time she would not simply follow Marcus's instructions without question. She would look and listen, and perhaps even speak. After all, everyone deserved to have their story heard, even fallen kings. 3 days passed before Mira worked up the courage to break Marcus's rules. The routine had settled into a predictable rhythm. Each evening, she would prepare the prisoner's meal under Ilara's watchful eye, then follow Marcus or one of his guards down to the dungeons. The walk through those increasingly cold and narrow corridors had become familiar, though no less unsettling. The weight of stone and shadow seemed to press down upon her shoulders with each step toward the depths where Thorne was kept. Each time she would kneel beside the cell door and slide the wooden bowl through the iron slot. Each time, Thorne would rise from his position against the far wall with that same fluid grace, approach the bars, and offer his quiet thanks. And each time, despite Marcus's stern warnings echoing in her ears, Mira found herself lingering just a moment longer than duty required. The stories about the previous servants who had died seemed increasingly implausible. If Thorne was truly the savage beast Marcus painted him as, surely she would have witnessed some evidence of it by now. Instead, she saw only a man who moved with careful control, who spoke with courtesy when he spoke at all, and whose eyes held depths of intelligence that contradicted every tale of madness she had heard. On the 4th evening, Marcus was detained by other duties, leaving Mira in the care of 2 regular guards, men she recognized, but who paid her little attention beyond ensuring she completed her task. They were more interested in their own conversation about the approaching harvest festival than in supervising every moment of her interaction with the prisoner. It was then that Mira made her choice. Instead of stepping back immediately after, sliding the bowl through the slot, she remained kneeling beside the door. The guards were several feet away, their voices echoing softly off the stone walls as they debated the merits of the various ales that would be available at the festival. For the first time since beginning this duty, she felt truly alone with the man in the cell. Thorne approached as he always did, but this time when he reached for the bowl, he paused. Their eyes met through the bars, and she saw a flicker of surprise cross his features. "You're not afraid of me," he observed, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question, but Mira found herself answering anyway. "Should I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first expression of anything approaching warmth she had seen from him. "According to your Captain Marcus, most certainly." The mention of Marcus's name sent a chill through her, but she forced herself to remain steady. "Captain Marcus says many things." "Indeed." Thorne settled into a sitting position near the bars, the bowl balanced carefully in his shackled hands. "And what do you say?" It was a dangerous question, one that could lead them both into treacherous waters. But there was something in his manner, a genuine interest rather than manipulation, that encouraged honesty. "I say that actions speak louder than rumors," Mira replied carefully. "Wise words." He took a small spoonful of the stew, chewing thoughtfully. "You prepare this yourself?" "I help. The kitchen served many. There's care in the seasoning, someone with knowledge of herbs." His brown eyes studied her with interest. Not common knowledge among castle servants. Mira felt a flutter of alarm. Her grandmother's teachings were not something she advertised, particularly not to someone who might recognize their significance. "I've always had an interest in plants." "Have you now?" There was something knowing in his tone, but not threatening. "And what else interests you besides herbs and feeding dangerous prisoners?" Despite herself, Mira found her lips curving into a small smile. "Books, when I can find them. Stories of times past." "Ah, a scholar among the kitchen staff. How unexpected." Thorne's manner remained conversational, but she sensed a deeper purpose behind his questions. "What sort of stories?" "Old tales, legends, accounts of how things used to be." She paused, then took a calculated risk. "Before the rebellion." The change in Thorne's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The casual interest sharpened into something more focused, though still not threatening. "And what do these old stories tell you about those times?" "That perhaps the world was not always as it is now." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken implications hanging between them. From down the corridor, one of the guards laughed at something his companion had said, the sound echoing hollowly in the stone passage. "You should be careful," Thorne said finally, his voice dropping even lower. "Curiosity about the past can be dangerous in the present." "So I've been told." Mira hesitated, then added, "But some questions demand answers, regardless of the risk." "What questions?" She looked at him directly, studying the face that had once commanded the loyalty of an entire kingdom. The torchlight cast deep shadows, but she could see the intelligence there, the careful control, the absence of madness that everyone insisted defined him. "Questions about truth," she said simply. Thorne set down his spoon and leaned closer to the bars, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "Truth is a luxury few can afford in times like these, but not an impossibility." "No," he said, quietly. "Not an impossibility." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor above, growing steadily louder. One of the guards called out, "Time to go, girl. Captain's orders." Mira rose quickly, but not before Thorne spoke once. "More." "The bowl," he said, holding it out to her through the slot. "Thank you for the care you put into preparing it." As she took the wooden vessel from his hands, their fingers brushed briefly. It was the first physical contact she had ever had with him, and she was struck by how warm his skin felt, how fundamentally human that simple touch proved him to be. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked softly. "I'll be here," he replied, and there was something almost like humor in his tone. The walk back through the dungeons passed in contemplative silence. The guards seemed unaware that anything unusual had occurred. chatting companionably about their plans for the evening. But Mira's mind was racing with the implications of what had just happened. She had spoken to the prisoner, not just exchanged pleasantries, but engaged in actual conversation about subjects that could be considered treasonous. More importantly, he had responded not as a madman or a monster, but as an intelligent, thoughtful individual who seemed as curious about her as she was about him. Back in the kitchen, she went through the motions of cleaning the bowl and completing her evening duties, but her thoughts remained fixed on those few minutes of conversation. Thorne's questions about her knowledge of herbs had been pointed. He clearly suspected she was more than she appeared to be, but rather than feeling threatened by his perception, she found herself oddly relieved. It had been years since anyone had looked at her and seen beyond the disguise of simple servitude. As she prepared for bed that night, Mira fingered the small silver pendant hidden beneath her nightgown. Her grandmother's teachings had included more than just the healing properties of various plants. She had also learned to read people, to recognize the signs of character and intent that others might miss. Everything she had observed about Alpha King Thorne suggested a man of intelligence, restraint, and genuine courtesy. Either he was the most accomplished actor she had ever encountered, or the stories about his madness and violence were fabrications designed to serve someone else's purpose. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask more questions, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, she would finally begin to get some answers. The pressed wildflower lay carefully between the pages of an old recipe book, its delicate petals preserved in shades of purple and gold. Mira had found it growing in a forgotten corner of the castle's herb garden, a small splash of color against the grey stone walls. Something about its resilience, blooming despite the harsh conditions, had reminded her of the man in the dungeons below. It had been a week since their first real conversation, and the evening visits had evolved into something neither of them openly acknowledged, but both clearly anticipated. The guards had grown comfortable with the routine, often positioning themselves far enough away to allow for quiet exchanges that wouldn't be overheard. Tonight, as she knelt beside the cell door with the wooden bowl, Mira made an impulsive decision. Along with the usual bread and stew, she slipped the pressed flour through the slot. Thorne approached as he always did, but when he reached for the bowl, he paused. The tiny flower lay beside the bread, its dried petals catching the torchlight like fragments of amber. "What's this?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "I thought—" Mira hesitated, suddenly uncertain about her gesture. "The cell is so grey. I thought you might appreciate something with color." For a long moment, Thorne simply stared at the flower. Then, with infinite care, he lifted it from the bowl and held it up to the light. His expression was unreadable, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the first crack she had seen in his carefully maintained composure. "It's been 5 years," he said quietly, "since anyone has given me something simply for the sake of beauty." The weight of those words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. 5 years of imprisonment, of being treated as nothing more than a dangerous animal to be fed and contained. Mira felt a surge of anger at the waste of it. Not just the years stolen from his life, but the casual cruelty of denying him even the smallest comforts. "Where did you find it?" Thorne asked, carefully tucking the flower into a fold of his shirt. "The herb garden. It was growing between the stones of the old wall. Autumn bellflower," he identified immediately. "They were my mother's favorite. She used to say they represented hope persisting in unlikely places." The personal revelation caught Mira off guard. In all their conversations, Thorne had been careful to avoid discussing his past in any detail, but now he seemed almost eager to share this memory. "She must have been a wise woman," Mira said. "She was. She taught me to see beauty in small things, to appreciate gestures of kindness regardless of their size." His eyes met hers through the bars, a lesson I had begun to forget until tonight. They settled into their usual positions, Thorne sitting near the bars, Mira kneeling on the cold stone floor. The guards were engaged in a heated debate about the merits of different hunting hounds, their voices echoing from further down the corridor. "May I ask you something?" Thorne said, breaking their comfortable silence. "Of course. Why did you really come to work in this castle? A woman with your education, your knowledge of healing arts, you could have found more comfortable positions elsewhere." Mira's breath caught. His perception continued to unsettle her, cutting through the carefully constructed story she had used to explain her presence here. "What makes you think I have formal education? The way you speak, the questions you ask, the fact that you can read. Yes, I've noticed you glancing at the inscriptions on the dungeon walls when you think no one is watching." His smile was gentle but knowing. "You're as much in disguise as I am, though your chains are of a different sort." The truth hovered on her tongue, dangerous and tempting. For 5 years she had carried her secrets alone, never trusting anyone enough to share the weight of her real identity. But there was something about Thorne's manner, the genuine interest, the lack of judgment, that made honesty seem possible. "I lost my family," she said finally, "in the aftermath of the rebellion. Sometimes hiding in plain sight is the safest option." "I understand that better than most." His voice carried a note of deep sympathy. "Loss has a way of reshaping us, forcing us to become people we never imagined we could be. Is that what happened to you? The reshaping?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently stroking the pressed flower he had tucked away. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of solitude and reflection. "I was a different man 5 years ago, perhaps too trusting, certainly too naive about the nature of ambition and betrayal. The rebellion taught me lessons I would have preferred never to learn." "What kind of lessons?" "That loyalty is rarer than gold. That those closest to you can become your greatest enemies. That sometimes the people who claim to act in your name care nothing for your actual wishes or beliefs." There was no bitterness in his tone, which somehow made his words more profound. This was not the rant of an angry man seeking revenge, but the quiet observations of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. "Do you regret trusting them?" Mira asked. "I regret the consequences of my trust, but I cannot regret having a nature that sees the best in people, even when experience suggests I should know better." His honesty was both touching and alarming. If he was truly as perceptive as he seemed, how long would it be before he uncovered her own secrets? And yet, rather than fear discovery, she found herself wanting to trust him with the truth. "The stories about you," she said carefully. "The madness, the violence, are convenient fictions," Thorne finished. "It's easier to justify keeping a mad dog chained in the darkness than to explain why a sane man has been imprisoned without trial for 5 years. But the servants who died were killed by others and blamed on me. It's remarkable how many convenient accidents can occur in a castle full of ambitious people." His expression grew grim. "Though I suspect you already know that castle life can be dangerous for those who ask the wrong questions or learn the wrong truths." The implication was clear. He was warning her in his own way about the risks she was taking by continuing these conversations. But instead of discouraging her, his concern only strengthened her resolve to understand what had really happened 5 years ago. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you're the first person in 5 years to treat me like a human being rather than a dangerous animal. Because you brought me a flower for no reason other than kindness. Because—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Because I sense in you a spirit that recognizes injustice, even when speaking against it could prove dangerous." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted whatever response Mira might have made. The guards were returning, their conversation about hunting dogs apparently concluded. "Time to go," one of them called out. As Mira rose to leave, Thorne spoke once more, his voice barely audible. "The flower, thank you. It will remind me that beauty still exists in this world, even in the darkest places." Walking back through the dungeon corridors, Mira felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them, the gift of the flower. had been a simple gesture, but it had opened a door to deeper understanding. She had seen past his careful composure to the man beneath, someone who had been shaped by loss and betrayal, but who had somehow retained his essential decency. More troubling was the growing realization that her feelings toward him were evolving beyond mere curiosity or sympathy. There was something compelling about his combination of strength and vulnerability, his intelligence tempered by genuine kindness. Despite the bars between them, despite the vast difference in their circumstances, she found herself drawn to him, in ways that had nothing to do with pity or fascination with his tragic story. Back in the kitchen, Ilara noticed her distraction immediately. "You seem troubled, child. Is your duty in the dungeons becoming difficult?" "It's complex," Mira admitted. "In what way?" Mira chose her words carefully. "I think perhaps not everything we've been told about the prisoner is accurate." Ilara's expression grew cautious. She glanced around the kitchen to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then moved closer. "What makes you say that? He's not the mad beast the stories describe. He's intelligent, courteous, even gentle. I've seen no evidence of the violence everyone speaks of." "Child," Ilara said softly, "you must be very careful about such observations. There are those in this castle who would view any sympathy for the former king as treasonous. But what if the sympathy is justified? What if he was wrongly imprisoned?" Ilara was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands working absently at kneading bread dough. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There are questions about that time that have never been satisfactorily answered. Questions about who truly benefited from the rebellion, and whether the cure was worse than the disease." She looked directly at Mira. "But such questions are dangerous to voice, and even more dangerous to investigate. Why are you warning me?" "Because I've grown fond of you, and because I remember what happens to people who dig too deeply into the past. The current lords did not come to power through entirely noble means, and they are not inclined to be merciful toward those who might expose their methods." That night, lying in her narrow bed, Mira stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the conflicting emotions swirling through her mind. Her conversations with Thorne had awakened something she had thought safely buried. Not just curiosity about the truth, but a personal investment in his welfare that went far beyond duty, or even justice. She was falling in love with him. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and terrified. It was impossible, dangerous, utterly foolish. He was a prisoner, a former king whose very existence was a threat to the current order. She was a servant, a woman whose real identity could get her killed if discovered. Any feelings between them were doomed from the start. And yet, as she finally drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was of the way his eyes had softened when he looked at the pressed flower, and the genuine gratitude in his voice when he thanked her for the simple gift of beauty in his dark world. The rebellion leader's letter was hidden beneath a loose stone in the castle's old archive room, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from 5 years of dampness and decay. Mira had discovered it quite by accident while searching for historical records that might shed light on the events leading up to Thorne's imprisonment. What she found instead was evidence of a conspiracy far more complex and disturbing than she had imagined. The letter was dated just 3 days before the rebellion began, written in the hand of Commander Willem Draith, the man now hailed as the hero who had saved the kingdom from tyranny. But the contents revealed motivations that had nothing to do with justice or the welfare of the people. "The preparations are nearly complete," the letter read. "Our allies in the noble houses have agreed to support the action in exchange for the promised land grants and tax exemptions. The Alpha King's reforms would have cost them dearly. His insistence on fair wages for workers and limits on noble privileges had made him many enemies among those who matter most. The Omega Girl has played her part perfectly, Her testimony about forced bonding and abuse will be crucial to justifying our actions. That she was his willing lover matters little. The people will believe what we tell them to believe. By the time this is over, Thorne will be remembered as a monster, and we will be the saviors who delivered the kingdom from his tyranny. Remember, no evidence must survive. Once we have control, all records of the true nature of his policies must be destroyed. History is written by the victors, and we shall write a history that serves our purposes. Mira's hands shook as she read and reread the damning words. The letter painted a picture of calculated betrayal that turned everything she had been told about the rebellion on its head. According to this account, Thorne had not been a tyrant, but a reformer whose policies had threatened the power and wealth of the noble class. The rebellion had not been a righteous uprising, but a coup orchestrated by those who stood to lose under his progressive rule. Most shocking of all was the mention of an Omega who had testified against him. The implication was clear. She had been Thorne's lover, but had been turned against him through lies and manipulation. The betrayal must have cut him deeply, explaining the careful way he had spoken about trust and the dangers of believing in those closest to you. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside sent Mira into a panic. She quickly rewrapped the letter and returned it to its hiding place, then busied herself with examining a collection of old household accounts, as if that had been her purpose all along. "What are you doing here?" Guard Captain Marcus stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Mira's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to appear calm. "Head cook Ilara asked me to research some old recipes," she said, holding up one of the household ledgers. "There's to be a feast next week, and she wanted to recreate some traditional dishes." Marcus stepped into the room, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller and more oppressive. Traditional dishes from before the rebellion. Apparently, some of the visiting nobles have requested authentic period cuisine. It was a plausible lie, and Mira held her breath as Marcus considered it. His eyes swept over the various documents scattered on the old wooden table, but he seemed to find nothing immediately suspicious. "How long have you been coming down here?" he asked. "This is my first time. Ilara only mentioned the feast preparations yesterday." "I see." Marcus moved closer, and Mira caught the scent of leather and steel that always seemed to cling to him. "And have you found what you're looking for?" "Some interesting recipes, yes, though many of the records are damaged by age and moisture." "Indeed. Well, finish your research quickly. This section of the castle is not meant for extended visits by kitchen staff." After he left, Mira remained motionless for several minutes, listening for any sign that he might return. Only when she was certain she was alone did she allow herself to breathe normally again. The encounter had been too close for comfort, and she realized that her investigation was drawing unwanted attention. But the information she had discovered was too important to abandon. If the letter was authentic, and she had no reason to doubt it, then Thorne had been imprisoned based on lies and fabricated evidence. The current rulers were not heroes, but opportunists who had seized power through deception and manipulation. That evening, as she prepared for her visit to the dungeons, Mira felt the weight of this knowledge pressing down upon her. How could she face Thorne, knowing what she now knew about the betrayal he had suffered? How could she pretend that nothing had changed when everything had changed? The guards seemed unusually alert as they escorted her through the dungeon corridors, their conversation subdued and their attention more focused on their surroundings. She wondered if Marcus had spoken to them about increased security, if her presence in the archives had raised suspicions she was not yet aware of. When she knelt beside Thorne's cell and slid the wooden bowl through the slot, her hands were steadier than she felt. He approached as always, but she noticed that his movements seemed more cautious than usual, as if he too sensed some shift in the atmosphere. "You seem troubled tonight," he observed as he accepted the bowl. "Do I?" She tried to keep her voice neutral, but his perception was too keen to be easily fooled. "Something has changed. What is it?" For a moment, she considered telling him everything, about the letter, about the evidence of conspiracy and betrayal she had uncovered, but the guards were close enough to overhear, and the knowledge would only cause him pain without offering any possibility of justice or freedom. Instead, she chose a partial truth. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the stories not being entirely accurate. And what conclusion have you reached? That perhaps you've been wronged more than I initially realized." Thorne set down his spoon and studied her face through the bars. "That's a dangerous conclusion for someone in your position to reach. Why? Because those who wronged me are still in power, and they are not inclined to be merciful toward anyone who questions the official narrative." His voice carried a note of warning. "You should be careful, Mira, very careful about what questions you ask and what truths you seek." The use of her name startled her. She hadn't realized he had learned it, though she supposed it was inevitable given the weeks of their conversations. "How do you know my name?" "I listen, I observe, and I remember details that others might overlook." His expression grew serious, including the fact that you've been asking questions in places where questions are not welcome. The implication was clear. Somehow he knew about her visit to the archives, either through his own network of information or simply through careful observation of her demeanor. He had deduced that her curiosity was leading her into dangerous territory. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "Of course you don't, but if you did, I would tell you that some secrets are worth preserving, but not at the cost of your life. The truth about the past cannot help either of us if you're dead." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken understanding hanging between them. Finally, Thorne spoke again. "There was someone I trusted once, someone I believed loved me as much as I loved her. Her betrayal was the final piece that made the rebellion possible." His voice was quiet but steady. "I would not see you suffer a similar fate because of misplaced loyalty to a lost cause." The pain in his words was unmistakable, and Mira felt her heart ache for the depth of betrayal he had endured. But she also heard something else, concern for her welfare that went beyond casual regard for a kind servant. "What if the cause isn't lost?" she asked softly. "Then it would require miracles I no longer believe in," Thorne replied. "And I would rather see you safe than see you become a martyr for truth that may never be acknowledged." The ancient map was tucked behind a false panel in the castle's oldest tower, its edges yellowed with age and corners worn soft by countless careful handlings. Mira had discovered it during what had become a dangerous obsession, searching the castle's forgotten corners for evidence of what had really happened 5 years ago. The map showed passages and rooms that no longer appeared on any official plans, secret ways that had been built into Raven's foundations centuries ago and apparently forgotten by its current occupants. More importantly, it showed a route from the dungeon levels to the outside world that bypassed every guard post and checkpoint currently in use. She traced the path with her finger, memorizing each turn and junction. If the map was accurate, and the detailed architectural notations suggested it was, there was a way to move through the castle's depths without detection. The knowledge felt like holding fire in her hands, both illuminating and dangerous. Over the past 2 weeks, her evening conversations with Thorne had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. They spoke of books they had read, places they had traveled, childhood memories that seemed to bridge the vast differences in their circumstances. She found herself looking forward to those stolen moments with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. Tonight, as she knelt beside his cell with the wooden bowl, she could barely contain the excitement of her discovery. "You seem different." "This evening," Thorne observed as he accepted his meal, "less troubled than you were last week." "Do I? There's something almost hopeful in your manner." His dark eyes studied her face through the bars. "Have you had good news?" Mira glanced toward the guards, but they were engaged in their usual conversation, paying little attention to the routine exchange between prisoner and servant. Still, she lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "I've been exploring." "Exploring what?" The castle, its history, its hidden places. Something flickered in Thorne's expression, interest perhaps, or concern. That can be dangerous. So, can remaining ignorant? She hesitated, then took a risk. There are ways through this place that most people have forgotten about. Thorne set down his spoon with deliberate care. When he looked at her again, his entire demeanor had shifted. The casual friendliness was gone, replaced by something more intense and focused. "Mira," he said quietly, "what exactly are you thinking?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to voice aloud. But the truth was that she'd been thinking about it, about the possibility that he didn't have to remain here, that the bars and chains were not as absolute as they seemed. "I'm thinking that 5 years is long enough for an innocent man to pay for crimes he didn't commit." Innocent. His laugh was bitter. "Who told you I was innocent?" The evidence did. The records from before the rebellion. The letter from "Stop." The command was quiet, but absolute. "Don't say anything more. Not here. Not like this." But it was too late. The guards had noticed the change in their interaction, the sudden tension that had replaced their usual quiet exchange. One of them was already moving closer, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked. "None at all," Thorne replied smoothly. "I was simply thanking the young woman for the care she puts into preparing my meals." The guard's suspicious gaze moved between them, but after a moment he seemed satisfied that nothing untoward was occurring. He returned to his position. Though Mira noticed, he remained more alert than before. "We can't talk about this here," Thorne said once they were alone again. "It's too dangerous." "Then where?" "Nowhere. There is nowhere safe for such conversations, and no purpose in having them." But Mira could see in his eyes that despite his words, the seed of possibility had been planted. For the first time since she had begun visiting him, she glimpsed something beyond resignation in his manner, a flicker of the man he had been before 5 years of imprisonment had worn down his hope. "You don't have to stay here," she whispered. "Yes, I do. These chains are not just iron, Mira. They're bound with magic that suppresses my strength, my abilities. Even if I could escape this cell, I would be no match for the guards in my current state." "What if the chains could be removed?" Thorne's breath caught. "How?" "There are keys, old keys in the archives. I think one of them might—" "No." The word came out sharp and final. "I won't have you risk your life for a fantasy." "What?" "If it's not a fantasy, then it's still not worth your death." "And that's what this would mean, Mira. If we were caught, if this went wrong, they would kill you without hesitation. I've already lost everything that mattered to me once. I won't be responsible for losing you as well." The admission hung between them like a confession. In trying to protect her, he had revealed the depth of his feelings, feelings that mirrored her own growing attachment to him. "You wouldn't be losing me," she said softly. "You'd be saving us both." "From what?" "Even if we could escape this castle, even if we could evade capture, where would we go? I'm the most wanted man in the kingdom. My face is known to every bounty, hunter and loyal guard from here to the borders. And you," he paused, studying her with that penetrating gaze, "you're not just a kitchen servant, are you? You're someone important, someone with secrets of your own." The perceptive observation caught her off guard. For weeks she had been probing his mysteries while somehow believing her own would remain hidden. But Thorne's intelligence was too sharp, his understanding of people too keen, for such naive assumptions. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Automatically, your knowledge of healing arts goes beyond simple herbalism. Your education is far superior to what any servant would possess. And there's something in your manner when you speak of the past that suggests personal investment rather than mere curiosity." His voice grew gentle but insistent. "Who are you really, Mira?" The question she had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. The moment when her carefully constructed disguise would finally fall away, revealing the truth she had hidden for 5 years. "Someone who lost everything in the same conspiracy that destroyed you," she said finally. Understanding dawned in Thorne's eyes. Your family was involved in the court. They were caught up in the purges after the rebellion. They were healers, royal healers, trusted advisors who had served the crown for generations. When the new regime took power, anyone with connections to the old court became a target. My parents, my grandmother, they were all killed as supposed traitors. And you survived by disappearing, by becoming invisible, by trading my identity for safety. She met his gaze directly, but I never stopped believing that the truth would eventually surface, that justice might eventually be possible. Justice! Thorne's voice carried a weight of bitter experience, a noble concept that rarely survives contact with political reality. It could, if people knew what really happened, if they understood that the rebellion was built on lies and manipulation. And how would you propose to accomplish that? Post notices on the castle walls, shout the truth from the battlements by proving it, by finding evidence that can't be dismissed or ignored, by... She hesitated, then plunged ahead. By freeing the rightful king and letting him reclaim what was stolen. Thorne was quiet for so long that she began to fear she had gone too far, pushed too hard against his carefully maintained defenses. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. You're asking me to believe in miracles again. I'm asking you to believe in truth, in justice. In the possibility that 5 years of suffering doesn't have to be forever. And if we tried and failed, then at least we would have tried. At least we would have fought for what's right instead of accepting what's convenient. Another long silence stretched between them before Thorne nodded slowly. "Show me the map," he said. The ancient bloodline scroll was hidden in the deepest vault of the castle's archive, sealed behind a door that required 3 different keys and bore warnings, in languages so old that few could read them. Mira had found the entrance quite by accident, while following the paths indicated on her stolen map, searching for alternate routes through the castle's forgotten spaces. What she discovered changed everything. The scroll itself was illuminated, with gold leaf and precious inks, its parchment treated with preservatives that had kept it intact for centuries. It was a genealogical record of the royal bloodlines of Ravenshollow, tracing the descent of kings and queens back through generations of careful documentation. At first, she had thought it merely a historical curiosity, until she found her own family name woven through the complex tapestry of noble lineage, House Ashford. Her grandmother's maiden name, the name that had been carefully erased from all official records after the rebellion. According to the scroll, they were not simply healers who had served the crown, they were themselves of royal blood, a cadet branch of the ruling house that had maintained their healing traditions while their cousins wore crowns. More shocking still was the revelation of her own position in the line of succession. With the current royal line believed extinct, and the noble houses that had supported the rebellion having no legitimate claim to the throne, Mira found herself staring at her own name as the last surviving heir to the kingdom of Ravenshollow. She was not just a kitchen servant hiding from persecution. She was a queen in exile. The implications hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping in the dusty silence of the ancient vault. Everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the world, was suddenly thrown into question. The pendant her grandmother had given her was not just a family heirloom. It was a royal seal, proof of her bloodline that would be recognized by anyone with knowledge of the old ways. But even more earth-shaking was the realization of what this meant for Thorne. If she was the rightful heir to the throne, then his imprisonment was not just unjust, it was illegal under the kingdom's fundamental laws. Only the monarch or their designated heir could order the detention of a former ruler. The current lords had no legal authority to hold him. Together, they would have the legitimacy to reclaim the kingdom. Separately, they were just victims of an illegal coup. Her hands shook as she carefully rolled up the scroll and tucked it beneath her cloak. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. Not just the revelation of her true identity, but the responsibility that came with it. She was no longer just Mira, the kitchen servant, hiding from a dangerous past. She was Queen Mira of Ravenshollow, and her kingdom was crying out for justice. The journey back through the castle's hidden passages felt endless. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound made her heart race with fear of discovery. If the current rulers learned what she had found, if they realized who she truly was, they would not hesitate to eliminate the threat she represented. But first, she had to tell Thorne. That evening, as she prepared for her visit to the dungeons, Mira felt as though she was carrying fire in her chest. The scroll was hidden beneath her clothing, pressed against her heart like a secret that burned to be revealed. Everything about this moment felt different. This would be the last time she knelt beside his cell as a servant bringing food to a prisoner. After tonight, they would both know the truth of who they really were. The guards seemed unusually relaxed, their attention focused on a dice game they had apparently been playing for several evenings. This was fortunate, because Mira suspected that what she was about to reveal would require more privacy than their usual whispered conversations allowed. Thorne approached the cell door, as always, but she could see in his eyes that he sensed something momentous in her manner. Over the weeks of their growing intimacy, he had learned to read her moods with startling accuracy. "You look like someone who has seen a ghost," he observed quietly. "In a way I have," she replied, kneeling beside the bars. "But perhaps not the kind of ghost you might expect." She slid the bowl through the slot, but instead of stepping back, she remained close to the bars. The guards were absorbed in their game, arguing good-naturedly about the rules and wagering small coins on the outcome. "I need to show you something," she whispered. "Here? Now? It can't wait." With infinite care, she drew the scroll from beneath her cloak and passed it through the bars. Thorne's eyebrows rose as he took in the ancient parchment, the formal seals, the obvious importance of the document. "What is this?" "Read it. The section about House Ashford." She watched his face as he unrolled the scroll, his eyes scanning the complex family trees and genealogical notations. At first his expression showed only polite interest, but as he found the relevant passages, she saw shock replace curiosity. "This can't be accurate," he said finally. "It is. I've verified it against other records. My grandmother wasn't just a healer who served the court. She was Princess Lyanna Ashford, daughter of King Edmund's younger brother. She gave up her title when she married my grandfather, choosing love over crown. But the bloodline remained." Thorne's eyes found hers through the bars, and she saw in them a mixture of awe and understanding. "You're not just a kitchen servant. I'm the last surviving member of the royal house. According to the laws of succession, with the current line believed extinct, the crown passes to the cadet branches." She took a shaky breath. "I am the rightful queen of Ravenshollow." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. In speaking them aloud, she had transformed not just her own identity, but the entire dynamic of their relationship. They were no longer prisoner and sympathetic servant, but two survivors of the same conspiracy, two people with equal claim to justice and restoration. "Sweet Mother of Mercy," Thorne breathed. "Do you understand what this means?" "That we were both victims of the same illegal coup, that your imprisonment has no legal foundation, that together we have the legitimacy to reclaim what was stolen from us both." Thorne carefully rolled up the scroll and passed it back to her. "It also means that you're in more danger than I ever imagined. If the current rulers discover your identity, they'll kill me, yes, just as they tried to kill everyone else who might threaten their hold on power." She tucked the scroll safely away. "But they won't discover it, not until we're ready." "Ready for what?" "To reclaim our kingdom, to restore the rightful order, to ensure that the truth about the rebellion finally comes to light." "Mira," he paused, then seemed to reconsider her name in light of this revelation. "Your Majesty, don't," she said quickly. "Not yet. Not until we're free of this place." This changes everything about your plan. If you're discovered helping me escape, it won't just be viewed as a servant sympathy for a prisoner. It will be seen as an act of war between rival claimants to the throne. Good, she said with a fierceness that surprised them both. Let them see it that way. Let them understand that their stolen authority is being challenged by those with legitimate right to rule. Thorne studied her face in the flickering torchlight, and she could see him recognizing the transformation that had occurred. The quiet, careful servant was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the weight of her birthright and the power that came with it. "You're not the same person who first brought me a meal 3 weeks ago," he observed. "Neither are you. We've both been changed by learning who we really are, not just our identities, but our responsibilities to each other and to the kingdom that was stolen from us. And if we do this, if we attempt to escape to reclaim the throne, what then? Even if we succeed, the kingdom has been ruled by the rebellion lords for 5 years. The people may not welcome the return of the old order. Then we'll show them that the old order was better than what replaced it. That justice and true legitimacy are worth fighting for." She met his gaze directly. "That love and trust can triumph over betrayal and lies." The last words carried more weight than perhaps she had intended, but she didn't regret them. The truth about her feelings for him was bound up with the truth about everything else. Their shared suffering, their growing understanding, their potential future together. "Love," Thorne repeated softly. "Yes, the one thing they couldn't destroy, couldn't corrupt, couldn't steal from us." She reached through the bars and touched his hand briefly. "The thing that makes all the rest worthwhile." From across the dungeon, a corridor, came the sound of the guards ending their game, preparing to escort her back to the upper levels of the castle. Their time was running out, but everything had changed between them. "Tomorrow night," she whispered. "Tomorrow night what? We begin planning our restoration in earnest. Not as prisoner and servant, but as king and queen, taking back what belongs to us." Thorne's fingers closed around hers for just a moment before she pulled away. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. The master key lay cold and heavy in Mira's palm, its ancient iron surface etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She had found it exactly where the oldest archived documents suggested it would be, in a sealed chamber beneath the castle's original foundation, wrapped in silk that had somehow survived centuries of neglect. According to the records she had painstakingly translated, this key had been forged by the kingdom's first mages, specifically to open any lock created by their enchantments. More importantly for their current purposes, it could release the magical bindings that held Thorne's shackles in place. 3 days had passed since her revelation about the bloodline scroll. 3 days of careful planning and desperate preparation. The castle's routine continued around them, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. Mira moved through her daily duties with the focused intensity of someone who knew their world was about to be transformed forever. She had not been idle. In gathering allies, old Willem, the castle's head groundskeeper, had served under the previous regime and remembered the prosperity and justice of those days. When approached carefully, with hints rather than direct statements, he had proved surprisingly willing to assist with small tasks that might aid in righting old wrongs. A door left unlocked here, a guard's attention diverted there. Nothing that could be traced back to him if things went badly. Sarah, a laundrymaid whose brother had been executed in the purges following the rebellion, needed even less convincing. Her hatred for the current rulers burned with steady intensity, and she was more than willing to help create the chaos that would be necessary to cover an escape attempt. Most valuable of all was Thomas, a young guard who had grown increasingly disillusioned with his duties. His father had been a soldier under King Thorne's command and had spoken often of the honor and nobility that had characterized the old army. When Marcus had ordered him to participate in the interrogation and execution of suspected dissidents, Thomas had begun to question whether he was serving the right cause. Mira had approached him with the same careful indirection she had used with the others, but his response had been immediate and wholehearted. Not only was he willing to help, he had information about guard rotations, patrol schedules, and security procedures that would be crucial to the success of their plan. The shift change happens at midnight, he had whispered during a brief encounter. In the castle courtyard, there's always a 15-minute gap when the corridors are less carefully watched. If something were to happen, then something will happen then, Mira had assured him. But even with allies in place and the means to free Thorne from his magical bonds, she was haunted by doubts about what would come after. Escaping the castle was only the beginning. They would need somewhere to go, some way to rally support for their cause, some means of proving their legitimacy to a kingdom that had been told for 5 years that the old rulers were dead. These concerns weighed heavily on her mind as she prepared for what might be her final evening visit to the dungeons as a servant. Tomorrow night, if all went according to plan, she would return not with a bowl of food, but with the key to his freedom. The guards seemed more relaxed than usual, their attention focused on plans for the upcoming harvest festival. It was perfect timing. The celebration would provide additional chaos and distraction, making it easier for their small band of conspirators to move unnoticed through the castle. Thorne was waiting near the bars when she approached, and she could see in his posture that he shared her nervous anticipation. Over the past 3 days, their evening conversations had taken on the urgency of final preparations, each detail discussed and refined until they both knew their roles by heart. "Tomorrow night," she said quietly as she passed him the wooden bowl. "Are you certain you want to do this?" His voice carried concern that went beyond mere strategic considerations. "Once we begin, there will be no turning back. If we fail, we won't fail." She spoke with more confidence than she entirely felt, but doubt was a luxury they could not afford. "Thomas has confirmed the guard rotations. Willem will ensure the outer gates are accessible. Sarah will create the distraction we need in the main hall. And if Marcus suspects something, he's been watching you more closely lately." It was true. The guard captain's attention had become increasingly focused on her movements, his questions more pointed and frequent. She suspected he was beginning to piece together connections he didn't fully understand. Her visits to the archives, her conversations with certain servants, the subtle changes in her demeanor that came from knowing her true identity. "Let him suspect," she said. "By the time he acts on his suspicions, it will be too late." Thorne set aside his meal and leaned closer to the bars. "Mira, I need you to understand what we're truly attempting here. Even if we escape, even if we successfully leave the castle, we'll be hunted by every soldier and bounty hunter in the kingdom. The life we're choosing will be one of constant danger. The life I'm living now is already dangerous. At least this way, we'll be fighting for something worthwhile. And if we die in the attempt, then we'll die as ourselves, as the people we were born to be, rather than the shadows we've been forced to become." She reached through the bars and touched his hand. "I would rather have 1 day of freedom with you than a lifetime of safety without you." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical caress. In the weeks since their first conversation, something profound had grown between them, part political alliance, part shared understanding. But underneath it all, something deeper and more personal than either had expected. "I love you too," Thorne said quietly. The simple words carried the weight of everything they couldn't say aloud, everything that had been building between them through stolen moments and whispered conversations. It was a love born of mutual respect and shared suffering, tempered by the knowledge that they might not survive to explore its full potential. "When this is over," Mira whispered, when we're free, we'll have time to discover what kind of life we can build together. But first, we have to earn that freedom." The sound of approaching footsteps signaled the end of their conversation, As the guards prepared to escort her back through the dungeon corridors, Mira felt the weight of the master key hidden beneath her clothing, pressing against her heart like a promise. "Tomorrow night," she repeated. "Tomorrow night," Thorne agreed. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Every routine task felt surreal. Every conversation with her fellow servants seemed layered with hidden meanings. Mira found herself studying faces, wondering who might be loyal to the old regime if given the choice, who might be counted on to support their cause when the truth was finally revealed. Ilara noticed her distraction immediately. "You seem unusually quiet today, child. Are you feeling well?" "Just tired," Mira replied. "The changing seasons always affect me." But Ilara's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Perhaps you should rest this evening. I could assign someone else to tend to the prisoner." The suggestion sent a spike of panic through Mira's chest. Tonight of all nights, she could not allow anyone else to take her place. "No, thank you. I'm fine, really. And I prefer to maintain the routine. It seems to keep him calmer when he sees familiar faces." Ilara studied her for a long moment, and Mira had the uncomfortable feeling that the older woman suspected more than she was saying, but after a pause, she nodded with evident concern. "Very well, but be extra careful tonight. There are rumors of increased security, something about concerns over festival preparations." The warning sent ice through Mira's veins. If security had been increased, their carefully planned timing might be compromised. She would need to find Thomas and warn him about the potential complications. As evening approached, Mira's nervous energy reached fever pitch. She prepared Thorne's meal with unusual care, knowing it might be the last time she performed this simple ritual that had brought them together. The wooden bowl that had become so familiar in her hands would soon be just a memory, replaced by whatever future they could forge together. The master key felt heavier than ever against her chest, its presence both thrilling and terrifying. In a few hours, she would use it to free the man she loved from 5 years of unjust imprisonment. They would either escape together into an uncertain but hopeful future, or they would die together in the attempt. Either outcome seemed preferable to the slow suffocation of their current existence. As she made her way toward the dungeon stairs, Mira caught sight of Marcus in the corridor ahead. He was speaking with 2 of his most trusted guards, their voices too low to overhear, but their postures suggesting serious discussion. For a moment, his eyes met hers across the space between them, and she felt a chill of recognition pass through his gaze. He knew something was wrong. Perhaps not the specific details of their plan, but he sensed the change in the castle's atmosphere, the subtle shifts that indicated conspiracy was afoot. But it was too late to turn back now. Their allies were in position, their escape route planned, their future hanging in the balance. Whatever Marcus suspected, whatever preparations he might be making, they would have to face those challenges as they came. The dungeon felt different tonight. The air seemed thicker, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Even the guards seemed more alert, their casual conversations subdued. Mira's heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt beside Thorne's cell, knowing that this might be the last time she would see him as a prisoner. "You look pale," Thorne observed as he accepted the wooden bowl. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Never," she said firmly. "But Marcus suspects something. The entire castle feels like it's holding its breath. Then we proceed as planned. Whatever obstacles we face them together." The determination in his voice steadied her nerves. This was the man who had once led armies, who had ruled a kingdom with wisdom and strength. If anyone could navigate the dangers ahead, it was him. "I have everything we need," she whispered, patting the key hidden beneath her cloak. "By dawn, you'll be free. By dawn, we'll both be free. Or we'll both be dead. Either way, we'll be together." It was a strange comfort, but a real one. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it as partners, as equals, as 2 people who had found love in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to fight for something better. Tonight, Alpha King Thorne would either reclaim his freedom or die in the attempt. And Mira would stand beside him, not as a servant bringing food to a prisoner, but as a queen fighting to reclaim her kingdom. The master key pulsed against her heart like a second heartbeat, counting down the moments until their carefully orchestrated plan would either deliver them from their long captivity or destroy them both. In the growing darkness of the castle corridors, revolution was stirring. The master key turned in the ancient lock with a sound like breaking chains. Mira's hands shook as the magical bindings that had held Thorne's shackles in place for 5 years finally released their grip. The iron bands fell away from his wrists and ankles with metallic crashes that seemed to echo through the dungeon like thunder, though she knew the sound was probably no louder than whispers. For a moment, neither of them moved. After so many weeks of separation by iron bars, the absence of physical barriers between them felt almost surreal. Thorne stood in the open doorway of his cell, and for the first time since she had known him, there was nothing preventing him from stepping forward, from reaching out, from claiming the freedom that had been stolen from him. "I had almost forgotten what it felt like," he said quietly, flexing his fingers and rotating his shoulders. Even in the dim torchlight, she could see the way his posture was changing, the careful restraint he had maintained for years beginning to give way to something more natural and powerful, to move without the weight of chains. "How do you feel?" "Like myself again, like—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Like a king." The transformation was remarkable. Without the suppressive effects of the magical shackles, Thorne's presence seemed to expand, filling the narrow corridor with an authority that had nothing to do with titles or crowns, and everything to do with inherent dignity and strength. This was the man who had once commanded the loyalty of an entire kingdom, who had inspired love and respect through justice and wisdom rather than fear. "We need to move quickly," Mira whispered, though part of her wanted to simply stand there and marvel at his transformation. "The shift change happens in 10 minutes. Thorne nodded, but before they could begin their escape, he reached out and took her hands in his. The touch sent electricity through her entire body, the first time they had been able to make contact without bars between them. "Before we go any further," he said, "I need you to know that whatever happens tonight, these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life. You saved me long before you found that key, Mira. You saved me by reminding me that I was still human." The words were like a benediction, acknowledging everything that had grown between them in stolen moments and whispered conversations. But there would be time for deeper declarations later, if they survived the next few hours. "Save the speeches for when we're both wearing our crowns," she said with a smile that was both tender and determined. They moved through the dungeon corridors with the careful silence of shadows, following the route Mira had memorized from the ancient maps. The stone passages seemed to hold their breath around them, as if the castle itself was conspiring to aid in their escape. Behind them, in Thorne's abandoned cell, lay the simple circlet of silver that had been stored with his few personal possessions. His restored crown, not ornate or jeweled, but bearing the simple dignity that had characterized his reign. Mira had insisted they retrieve it before leaving, knowing that symbols mattered in the political struggle that lay ahead. As they climbed toward the upper levels of the castle, following passages that had been forgotten by the current regime, they began to encounter the signs of their allies' work. Willem had indeed left certain doors unlocked, creating a clear path toward the outer courtyards. Sarah's promised distraction was already underway. They could hear the sounds of celebration and revelry from the main hall, where the harvest festival was providing perfect cover for their escape. But as they reached the level where they would need to cross open corridors to reach the final passage to freedom, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. Thomas, the young guard who had pledged his assistance, was standing in the shadows near the entrance to the passage they needed. But he was not alone. Marcus stood beside him, along with 6 armed guards in full battle gear. I had hoped I was. "Wrong about my suspicions," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the stone corridor. "But it seems I was correct about the depth of this conspiracy." Mira felt her heart sink as she realized what had happened. Thomas had not been the ally she believed him to be. Either he had been a plant from the beginning, or Marcus had discovered his involvement and turned him. Either way, their carefully planned escape route was blocked. "Captain Marcus," Thorne said, and his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a king addressing a subordinate. Even in these circumstances, even facing capture and probable death, he projected a dignity that made Marcus's position seem somehow diminished by comparison. "I see you've been busy, not as busy as your former majesty, it would seem. 5 years of planning this escape, using a kitchen servant to do your dirty work." Marcus's eyes moved to Mira with obvious contempt. "Though I suspect this particular servant is rather more than she appears." "Much more," Thorne said calmly. "But that's neither your concern nor your jurisdiction. Everything in this castle is my jurisdiction, prisoner, including treason, conspiracy, and attempted escape." Marcus gestured to his guards. "Take them both. The lords will want to question them thoroughly before deciding on the appropriate punishment." But as the guards moved forward, Thorne stepped protectively in front of Mira, and for the first time in 5 years, with his alpha strength fully restored and his purpose crystal clear, he was ready to fight. The royal scepter lay where it had been hidden for 5 years, wrapped in purple silk in the castle's highest tower. As Thorne lifted it from its resting place, the ancient gold seemed to catch fire in the morning light streaming through the arrow slits. The weight of it in his hands was both familiar and transformative, not just a symbol of office, but a tangible connection to the legitimacy that had been stolen from him. The battle in the corridors had been swift and decisive, without the magical shackles suppressing his abilities. Thorne had proved to be everything the stories claimed, and more. His alpha strength, refined by years of careful self-control, had made quick work of Marcus's guards. The captain himself now knelt in the castle's great hall, bound and awaiting judgment for his role in the conspiracy. But the real victory had come not through violence, but through revelation. When the sounds of fighting had drawn other guards and servants to investigate, they had found not a madman escaping from his prison, but a king reclaiming his throne. More importantly, they had found him standing beside a woman whose bloodline credentials, once examined, proved her right to rule to be even stronger than his own. Word spread through the castle like wildfire. Servants who had lived through the old regime recognized the justice and prosperity that had characterized those days. Guards who had grown weary of enforcing the harsh rules of the current lords remembered what it meant to serve with honor. Even some of the lesser nobles, those who had been excluded from the inner circle of power that had controlled the kingdom for 5 years, began to see opportunity in supporting the rightful ruler's return. The confrontation with the rebellion lords themselves had been anticlimactic. Faced with documentary evidence of their conspiracy, abandoned by their own supporters, and confronted by the legitimate heirs to the throne, they had surrendered without significant resistance. Willem Draith, the supposed hero of the rebellion, had proved to be a coward when faced with the consequences of his actions. Now, as dawn broke over Ravenshollow Castle, Thorne stood in the throne room that had been denied to him for 5 years. The great hall buzzed with activity, as servants prepared for the restoration ceremony that would officially return the kingdom to its rightful rulers. Mira entered the hall, carrying the Unity Crown, the symbol they had commissioned from the castle's master craftsmen during the night hours following their victory. Forged from silver taken from both their family crests, it represented not just their individual claims to rule, but their partnership in rebuilding what had been broken. "The people are gathering in the courtyard," she reported. "Word has spread to the surrounding villages. They want to see for themselves that the old line has returned." Thorne nodded. but his attention was focused on her face rather than her words. In the hours since their escape, he had watched her transform from the careful, hidden woman he had known into someone magnificent, a queen in truth as well as title, someone who wore authority as naturally as she wore her smile. "Are you ready? For this?" he asked. "To rule a kingdom, to rebuild what was nearly destroyed, to spend my life beside the man I love?" Her smile was radiant. "I've been ready since the moment I first looked into your eyes and saw not a monster, but a man worth saving." They walked together toward the great doors that led to the courtyard, where hundreds of their subjects waited to witness their restoration. Behind them came the nobles and officials who had declared their loyalty to the rightful crown, including Thomas, who had proved his worth by helping to secure the castle's defenses during the night. As they stepped into the morning light, a cheer arose from the assembled crowd that seemed to shake the very stones of the ancient castle. These were people who remembered the prosperity and justice of the old reign, who had suffered under the harsh rule of the rebellion lords, who had hoped for years that somehow their rightful king might return. Now they saw not just one ruler, but two, their beloved king restored to his throne, standing beside a queen whose bloodline gave her an even stronger claim to their loyalty. The formal ceremony was brief but meaningful. The unity crown was placed not on one head, but shared between them, its dual bands allowing both rulers to wear the symbol of their joint authority. The ancient words of kingship and queenship were spoken, witnessed by hundreds of subjects whose cheers echoed across the mountains. But for Thorne, the most meaningful moment came when Mira took his hand as they faced their people together. The wooden bowl that had brought them together was gone, replaced by golden chalices from which they would drink at state banquets. The pressed wildflower had been replaced by formal bouquets and royal regalia, yet beneath all the ceremony and symbolism, the essential truth remained unchanged. They had found each other in the darkness and chosen love over fear, hope over despair, justice over convenience. The kingdom of Raven's Hollow had its rightful rulers restored, and those rulers, tested by adversity and strengthened by shared struggle, were ready to build a future worthy of the trust their people had placed in them. As the cheers of the crowd washed over them like a benediction, Thorne squeezed Mira's hand and whispered words meant for her alone. "Thank you for teaching me to believe in miracles again." Her response was equally quiet, but no less profound. "Thank you for showing me that love really can conquer all." Together they turned to face their kingdom and their future, the unity crown glinting in the morning sunlight like a promise of better days to come. 1 year later, the kingdom of Raven's Hollow bloomed like a garden after long winter. The unity crown rested on its specially crafted stand in the royal chambers, its intertwined bands of silver catching the afternoon light that streamed through windows that had been thrown open to welcome the spring air. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the castle during the rebellion years was gone, replaced by something that felt alive and hopeful. Mira stood at the window, watching the activity in the courtyard below. Merchants were setting up stalls for the weekly market, their colorful wares creating a festival atmosphere that had become commonplace since the Restoration. Children played between the stalls, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had heard too little joy for too many years. The changes went far deeper than mere atmosphere. The harsh taxes that had impoverished the kingdom's farmers had been reduced to fair and reasonable levels. The corrupt officials who had enriched themselves at the people's expense had been replaced with administrators chosen for competence and integrity. The arbitrary laws that had allowed nobles to abuse their tenants had been reformed, creating a system of justice that served all citizens equally. Most importantly, the fear that had permeated every aspect of life under the rebellion lords was gone. People spoke freely, traveled safely, and built their lives with confidence that their rulers genuinely cared about their welfare. "You're smiling," Thorne observed as he entered their private chambers. Even after a year on the throne, she never tired of watching the way he moved, with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world and was comfortable with the responsibilities it entailed. I was thinking about how different everything is now, how much has changed since that first night when I brought you supper in a wooden bowl. Thorne moved to stand beside her at the window, his arm settling naturally around her waist. The casual intimacy of the gesture still sent warmth through her, even after months of marriage and shared rule. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up the quiet life you had built for yourself, trading safety for the constant demands of ruling a kingdom?" "Never," she replied without hesitation, "though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had been too frightened to break Captain Marcus's rules that first evening. Someone else would have discovered the truth eventually. Justice has a way of surfacing given time, perhaps, but we might have lost years waiting for that someone else to act." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their subjects go about their daily lives, with the contentment that came from knowing they were well governed and fairly treated. The kingdom had not just survived the transition back to legitimate rule. It had flourished in ways that exceeded even their most optimistic hopes. "The delegation from the eastern provinces arrives tomorrow," Thorne said eventually. "They're eager to formalize the trade agreements we've been negotiating. And the southern lords have finally agreed to the new tax structure, with minimal grumbling. It's remarkable how cooperative people become when they realize that fair governance benefits everyone, including the governors." Mira laughed. "Who would have thought that treating people with respect and dignity would be such an effective approach to leadership? Revolutionary concept, certainly. Their shared humor was touched with the darker memories of what they had witnessed during the rebellion years, the casual cruelty, the arbitrary exercises of power, the way fear had been used as a tool of control. Never again, they had promised each other and their kingdom. Never again would Ravenshollow be ruled by those who saw their subjects as resources to be exploited rather than people to be served. "I received word from the border provinces today," Mira said. "The harvest prospects look excellent, better than they've been in over a decade. Peace and prosperity tend to improve agricultural yields. Who knew? There was satisfaction in these simple successes, in the knowledge that their reign was creating tangible improvements in people's lives. The grand gestures of kingship, the ceremonies and formal occasions had their place, but the real measure of their success lay in mundane details like harvest reports and trade agreements." A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted their conversation. Thomas entered, wearing the insignia of the captain of the Royal Guard, a position he had earned through his courage during the Restoration and his unwavering loyalty in the months since. "Your Majesties, forgive the interruption. There's a delegation here to see you, representatives from the Guild of Healers." Mira's eyebrows rose with interest. Since the Restoration, she had worked to rebuild the healing traditions that had been suppressed during the rebellion years. Her grandmother's knowledge, combined with recovered texts from the royal archives, had allowed them to establish training programs that were already producing skilled healers throughout the kingdom. "Show them to the small audience chamber," she instructed. "We'll receive them there." As Thomas departed to carry out her orders, Thorne smiled at the eagerness in her voice. "You still get excited about the healing work. It's where I can make the most direct difference. Ruling a kingdom is important, but teaching someone to save a life with their own hands, that's transformative in a way that goes beyond politics. One of the many reasons I fell in love with you, your ability to see the person behind the title, the individual story behind the grand narrative." They made their way through corridors that had once felt oppressive and threatening, but now bustled with the productive activity of a well-run court. Servants nodded respectfully as they passed, but without the fearful subservience that had characterized interactions during the rebellion years. These were people who took pride in their work and their service to rulers they respected. In the small audience chamber, 5 members of the Healers Guild waited with barely contained excitement. Their leader, an elderly woman named Cordelia, stepped forward as the royal couple entered. "Your Majesties, we bring news that we hope will please you. The healing school has graduated its first class of fully trained practitioners. 20 men and women who are ready to serve the kingdom with skills that equal those of the old royal healers." "That's wonderful news," Mira said, and meant it. "When will they begin their assignments?" "They're ready to depart immediately. We've identified communities throughout the kingdom that have had no access to trained healers since the purges. With your permission, we'll begin placing them within the week. You have our full support, as always." As the healers departed, clearly delighted by the royal approval of their work, Thorne took Mira's hand. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said quietly. "I hope so. I hope she would see that her teachings didn't die with her, that the knowledge she preserved has found its way back into the world. More than that, she would see that her granddaughter became exactly the kind of leader she raised her to be. Someone who uses power to heal rather than harm, to build rather than tear down." Evening was approaching, painting the castle walls with golden light that seemed to promise continued prosperity and peace. In a few hours, they would attend a state dinner, with visiting dignitaries, discussing treaties and trade agreements, and all the formal business of kingship. But for now, they stood together in the quiet of their private chambers, two people who had found love in the darkest of circumstances and used that love to light the way to a better future. The wooden bowl that had brought them together was long gone, but its simple message remained that kindness offered freely without expectation of reward could change the world. They had learned that lesson in a dungeon cell lit by flickering torches, two lost souls finding hope in each other's company. Now they ruled a kingdom transformed by the same principle, where every policy and decision was guided by the understanding that real strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to serve them with dignity and compassion. As the Unity Crown caught the last light of day, its silver bands gleaming with the promise of continued partnership, Thorne and Mira looked out over their kingdom and knew that they had kept faith with the love that had saved them both. In the darkness of a prison cell, they had dared to believe in miracles. Now they lived in one every single day,